Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion about these culturally structured patterns of eating today by talking about gender. And of course, these conversations are never to define who you are as an eater, but like with the food law lectures, this is to explore how influences around us can subconsciously or maybe consciously affect what we eat. And if anything we've learned about food so far is that preferences can and do change and can be learned and relearned. So none of the patterns we're going to be talking about today are set in stone, and probably many will change during your lifetime or that of your kids. And if you talk to your grandparents and your parents about gendered patterns of eating, you might be able to sense some differences that have occurred along with generational change. So while we're discussing how gender shapes patterns of food and eating and cooking as we move into the second half of the course, just keep in mind the real point here is to become a critical thinker about food. And I think anthropology is a great way to explore this type of systematic critical thinking. And I really just want you to understand how preferences are generated, how they're negotiated, and how they change over time. And of course, gender is a great way to look at that. So I'll start with a little story. Before the pandemic, I took my kids to the donut shop, Guru Donuts, downtown for a special treat. At the time, my son was 1 and my daughter was 3, and she very clearly self-identifies as a girl and is really into everything pink as part of her socialization into this gender. So her dad's talking to her about the flavor, and she's looking at these two, the bright pink and the pale pink donuts. And he says, oh, the bright pink one, it tastes like blood orange, and the light pink one, it tastes like strawberries. Oh, you love strawberries. What flavor do you want? He asks. And she says, I want the one that tastes like pink. Now, luckily, of course, their blood orange is delicious, and she loved it. But I found it so interesting that she wasn't selecting her donut based on the flavor. She was selecting the donut based on her gender. And of course, she was very happy with the donut that she got. So that's wonderful. But she's clearly picking up on gendered cues about food by her 3rd birthday. And so you can only imagine what's happened over the course of your lifetime and all the different gendered cues you've gotten about food. And so I asked this question a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is food gendered? And I encourage you to go back and take a look at your notes from your discussion on gender and food and think about the results of that discussion. And a way to explore this question is to think, are there feminine foods? Are there foods that if you want to feel feminine, you would eat? Are there masculine foods? Are there foods if you want to feel masculine, you would eat? If you're in a context with same-gendered people or opposite-gendered people, would this affect the way that you eat and whether you choose feminine or masculine foods? And perhaps, are there gender-neutral foods, equal opportunity foods? So just take a second to think about what you remember discussing from that activity. And of course, before we go through this whole discussion on gender and food, I, as an anthropologist, must remind you of differences between the words sex and gender. So anthropologists think about them differently. There's lots of different types of anthropology. Studying culture is one of them, but studying human biology is another. And we tend to consider sex a biological concept. And it's both genetically determined by chromosomes that you inherit from your parents, but it's also very much physiologically constrained. So I teach a class on the evolution of the human life cycle, and gender differentiation in utero is a really complicated process. And the result is not always a clear cut to sex, body. So sex is something we think about genetically or physiologically, but when we talk about gender, it's a different story. So anthropologists think about gender as a cultural concept, something that's socially determined. So color preferences are one of them. Color preferences are socially determined. There's a wonderful article from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1918 where they're recommending colors for babies, and the recommendation is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. Because pink is closer to red, and that's more manly, and blue is soft like the primrose, and that's more feminine. Now, of course, these patterns changed following World War II, And now it's easy to think that girls have some innate preference for pink, like my daughter and her donuts. But in reality, they're picking up on these social and cultural gendered expectations. And food is more of the same story, just like cultural preferences. If you look cross culturally, there's lots of different gendered preferences for food and what's considered masculine or feminine food. Now, I can't help myself as an anthropologist because I do teach an introduction to cultural anthropology class, and we talk about gender in there, and we discuss lots of case studies where there are not just two genders. So if you're interested in learning about societies with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 genders, you should take Anthropology 102. It's fun. So some tips on how to be a food anthropologist, how to think like an anthropologist about food to help yourself explore these concepts. We have been doing some of this already, and Food Journal 4 was an example of that. So first of all, just become a good observer. So if you perceive a food to be gendered as feminine or masculine or not gendered, just open your eyes and look around, especially if you're in, well, I guess, if you're in like the dining hall ever again, right, or a restaurant. See what people are eating and see if your perception, your perception of what is gendered matches reality. I would really encourage you to do a little experiment, to do what makes you feel uncomfortable in terms of eating gendered foods, and do it socially, and then think about why it makes you feel uncomfortable. Like with our table manners journal entry, whenever you feel uncomfortable in a social situation, this is a trigger that's telling you, there's an alarm going off saying like, hey, my behavior is not conforming, or somebody's behavior is not conforming to expected norms. What's going on? And so if you do something that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's a great way to remind yourself to think about what are the norms that are happening here and how am I or someone else violating them. And then finally think about what would happen if the norm suddenly became arbitrary. So if you want to think about gender in food, eat a food that you perceive as belonging to a different gender from your own, and especially do this in social contexts. So if you go out with your, gal pals and you choose a very masculine food, think about how that might make you feel. Or if you're out with your guy friends and you choose a very feminine food, one that you perceive as feminine, how does that make you feel? Do other people remark on it, or does the socialization into gender continue? Just become more aware, and being uncomfortable is a great way to make yourself more aware. I think these yogurt commercials are hilarious, but clearly yogurt would be a great example. It tends to be a feminized food. I'm not sure why. It's just a biological process of curdling milk, basically, but somehow it's become gendered as feminine. So if you want an example of something to test this with, perhaps test it eating yogurt in a social situation, or even just putting it in your grocery cart at the store. Now we're going to start moving into eating, just explorations of eating and cooking. And we can ask, are eating and cooking gendered? So what about things like the foods that you put in your mouth in social situations? I want to go back to the time of your parents and maybe even possibly your grandparents, because very commonly your same gendered parent has passed on some of their perceived gendered patterns of eating to you. So if you have perceived gendered patterns of eating, you've probably inherited at least some of that from your parents' gendered patterns of eating. So let's go back, just pick a decade, 1970s France. It's like the US, but different enough to be a little bit foreign, so we can feel comfortable analyzing it. And the norm in 1970s France is abundance for the males because they do hard work and need the calories out on the farm, supposedly, and restriction for the females. Okay, so women in France in the 1970s, men do hard work and women do self-denial, right, for the good of the family. And these food norms from the past have very much have clung to us, and you can see that them popping up in pop culture, like the Beauty and the Beast animated version from the 90s. And you can see here's Belle sipping she takes 2 bites of food through the whole movie, I think. There's a wonderful article from Cosmopolitan magazine about the disordered eating of Disney characters, and they really go off on Belle. So check that out if you're interested. And here's her male counterpart, right? Gaston, every day I eat 5 dozen eggs, so I'm roughly the size of a barge. This is also not a very healthy eating pattern to eat 60 eggs every day. But these are logical extensions of these gendered patterns of eating that were prevalent in France in the 1970s. And it's close enough to our culture that we might take these for granted, but if you go back another couple of hundred years to the early 1800s, there was a very different depiction of beauty for women and different gendered patterns of eating to try to achieve this standard of beauty. So a publication in the early 1800s, The Physiology of Taste, urges thin women to fatten themselves up. And the recommended diet is plenty of bread, hot chocolate, fresh eggs scrambled in butter, and of course, beer. That's the feminine diet of the early 1800s. And these were tied to the standards of beauty in France at the time, which we'll talk about in a second, are also tied to class. And the ideal was for women to be fat. So you can see the ad here on the right, get fat with Loring's Fatten You and Corpula Foods. And the reality is standards of beauty are culturally determined, just like eating patterns. And often the two are tied together. And both are primarily determined by the society and culture that you live in, not necessarily by any one true, natural, beautiful human figure. And it's quite clear that there's no one ideal for human beauty when you read news stories in places like Mauritania. So there's some headlines. Headlines like this are usually an extreme version of a more general pattern. But in Mauritania, there is concern that girls are encouraged to eat and given extra food around puberty to help them gain weight so they can become more attractive as marriage partners. And like many other gendered patterns of eating, here women's bodies are symbols of wealth and status for their husbands and fathers. And so a line from the article reads, "The glory of man is measured by the fatness of his woman." So just like in other cultural contexts, standards of feminine beauty are tied to diets and eating. And you can think of a different cultural context, like US. What do you think the headline would read in the US? And how does that relate to gendered patterns of eating here? And I'm not saying one is more right than the other. They're just different. So if you want to take a pause to think about that, now would be a great time. Okay. It's not just about body shape, though. There's lots of different gendered patterns of eating. I love these Liberation Raptors from a Japanese burger chain, Freshness Burger. And there's some concern for Japanese women about the face that they make when you take a giant burger and take a big bite of it. And so the wrapper depicts a petite, clean, closed mouth that you can hide behind while you take large bites of your delicious Freshness Burger. And, of course, these gender norms aren't limited to women. There's lots of norms about masculinity and eating as well. I love this KFC ad campaign that was running last year, Man Up Mondays. Prove your manliness every Monday by eating a large meal at KFC. I find it a little concerning that they suspect that your manliness slowly degrades over the week and you gotta recharge your manliness every Monday, but nice that they're offering a way to do so. And manly eating patterns, just like womanly eating patterns, being socially determined, they all have their own quirks of logical extensions. And so, one of the things about masculine eating patterns is that usually protein is pushed very much forward. So, a manly meal must therefore require protein. And you can see, of course, here these manly Father's Day recipes, lots of meat featured, especially in these 12 manly salads. But the reality is, by this gender norm of a meat and potatoes diet and beer, like our feminine diet from France in the 1800s, lots of beer and eggs and that kind of thing. Of course, these are all arbitrary. But the reality is, these days, with the meat and starch forward for masculine foods, that men are less likely to get enough fruits and vegetables in their diet, and they're also less likely to stick to reasonable portion sizes. So we'll flip back to the manly meals here, and you can see that quantity is definitely highlighted here. And I know there's a lot of reality eating shows where men travel around the country to see how much they can consume. Ironically, this dietary pattern being masculine means that a feminine diet tends to include a lot less meat, especially red meat. And women in the U.S. are less likely to get enough iron, which they actually need more of, especially once young women start menstruating. They need extra red meat compared to boys. So, these diets, these culturally and socially determined diets, are sometimes so divorced from the physiological realities of what we need to eat that they can actually be minorly harmful to our health and well-being. And this is especially true in the countries here that you see in the chart. And this idea of a boy need to be fed to grow large. So you can think if he's a growing boy. This has actually become an issue in some countries where young boys are being overfed, and young boys tend to be less realistic about their body weight. Young boys tend to be less likely to be recognized as obese than young girls. And a lot of this can be tied to a small appetite considered to be less masculine. And especially in countries that have become wealthy recently and have had American-style fast food introduced, there has become a growing problem with overeating, like in Saudi Arabia, as young boys are encouraged to eat large amounts of high-calorie food. I say this not for students to think, oh, poor boys in Saudi Arabia. That's not the point. The point is to think about how gendered patterns of eating affect behavior, and how gender and biology and behavior are all three different things and sometimes not very well connected. Another thing that I wanted to talk about with gender, as I mentioned, is gender and class. So where do these gendered patterns of eating come from? And because gendered expectations are often dictated by the resources the upper class has access to, we can look at how patterns of wealth and access affect gendered expectations and patterns of eating. So think of tanning, for example. Go back 200 years. What's the ideal? To be, pale as possible. And that means, or at least paler than other people, and that means that wealthy women in particular were expected to be able to sit in the house all day and not do labor. Whereas lower class, lower status women were expected to be out working in the fields and therefore tanning and having darker skin. Now the opposite has become true. Wealthy women are able to go outdoors more often during the daytime and more able to afford vacations to sunny places in the winter. Meanwhile, lower class, lower status women oftentimes have more indoor jobs these days and can't afford to, fly off to Hawaii every January. So gender and class are definitely tied, and this is true for food too. So those women in the 1800s, high status women had access to the amount of calories to make them fat. Low status women didn't. Now it's the opposite. High status women can afford nutritious, healthy food and the time it takes to prepare it. Lower status women often can't. I think of time for exercise versus hard labor. It used to be the amateur sportsmen could participate in the Olympics, not the professional, let's say, dock worker, for example, because that would be unfair. And so now that higher status people have more time for exercise and maybe are not doing the hard labor of lower status people, we see different gendered patterns of exercise and physical ideals as well. These are wonderful topics you can also explore in Anthropology 102 if you are so curious, but at the very least pay attention. What types of body and nutrition and exercise are expected for different genders? Who can achieve those? How are they set? All wonderful rabbit holes to take yourself down as you go through your education. But of course, I also wanted to talk about how cooking is gendered. And I love this little Dear Abby article that came out a few years ago. Dear Abby, you see these in the newspaper. In your opinion, whose place is it to bake a birthday cake for a man? So right off the bat, lots of gendered implications here. Is it his wife's or his mother's? So first of all, let's even think, is somebody baking? How are they baking? Like, what kind of baking has happened? Is it a box mix? Is it like from scratch? Is it one of those fancy cakes that have become so popular? And the expectation that this woman is really upset that his wife is baking the cake and she's his mom and she thinks it's her job to bake the cake. Now, I'm too busy to bake cakes these days, so I gladly would love someone else to bake a cake. But there's a really interesting power struggle here between the wife and the mother of this man of who's going to get to celebrate his birthday. And this action of love that is cooking. And how that love is celebrated. So think about it. If this was a man writing in, it said, Dear Abby, whose place is it to bake a birthday cake for a woman? Her husband's or her father's? It brings a different interpretation to this. So if you want to know more, take Anthropology 102. And we also have a wonderful class on kinship where we talk more about this. But if you want to think about cooking and whether or not it's gendered and how it's gendered, I love to think about Adam Smith because his whole treatise is centered around the idea of getting dinner. And the idea that the butcher and the baker who are providing the bread and the meat for your dinner do not provide their services for free, hence the, free market, capitalism, and all that. But he takes very much for granted one key aspect of getting dinner is that, yes, the butcher and the baker made the meat and the bread for you, but who cooked them? How did it get onto your plate? He does not mention this at all. And so he's taking one key service for granted, this of in-home care work like cooking. And in reality, the person probably preparing his meals was his mother, Margaret Douglas, who's pictured here. And wouldn't I love to have someone at home preparing all my meals for me while I get to engage in my economic flights of fancy. I do a little bit of economic anthropology too. And this is really apparent in how the U.S. counts work in terms of gross domestic product, GDP, and in-home care work is not tracked as part of GDP. And some economists have estimated that if you had to pay someone to do all of the work in the home that you would not do, so cooking, if you're Adam Smith, cooking the dinners and washing the dishes and doing the laundry and sweeping the floors and, all of this in-home care work, that it could be for Canada as much as a third of their gross domestic product if you had to pay someone to do all of these things for people. And, up to $6 trillion in the U.S. And this just highlights a gender differential in what counts as work and what's the worth of home care work like cooking. And, care work and other services like working in facilities that care for the elderly, for example, is usually underpaid compared to other similarly typed service jobs on the market. And I just want to show you the next slide briefly. There's some charts here. You can take a pause and look at them more closely. But there still remains these gender differences. Even though women have now entered the labor market, even with both spouses working full-time, there's still a difference in the amount of in-home care work that goes on in terms of things like cooking dinner and going grocery shopping. So feel free to pause the video and take a look at these if you want. Not only are women more likely to do in-home care work like preparing meals, but there's also a difference in perception. So men are more likely to perceive equality in chore preferences than women. So think about, this is data from the Pew National Research Center. It's a reliable source. Perhaps think about what some of these patterns mean for your own life. And again, just like I was saying at the beginning, I'm not saying this is the way things should be or shouldn't be or ought to be. I'm just saying here's the data on the general pattern in the US. What do you think about that? Engaging in critical thinking means being aware of data patterns, being able to interpret them, and also being able to compare from general patterns to personal patterns and extract meaning from them. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention here was to think about, okay, so women more generally do home cooking than men, of course. There's no biological reason why this must be the case. It's just the social and cultural pattern that has been set in the US over the last several generations. But when you think about professional chefs, like who's in the professional kitchen, and I know a lot of people in class are or were in food service, who's going to be in the kitchen at a restaurant? Is there usually more of one gender in the kitchen than another? And to think about why might this be the case. So in a normal in-person class, we'd have a little in-class discussion here, but perhaps this might be a conversation that if you do work in food service or know somebody who does, to have a little conversation with them about these gendered patterns and what kind of eating and cooking patterns they result in. Okay, last slide. The question is, does any of this really matter? Like, how does becoming aware of these patterns, and that's really what I want you to be able to do, is to become aware of gendered cooking and eating patterns. Does it matter? In the big picture, these patterns affect who eats what and how much of that. And I've mentioned there's some unhealthy patterns of gendered eating around the world. If these patterns don't suit you, be aware that there's nothing normative about them. So I want you to become aware of them and also feel the freedom to be able to eat the food that nourishes yourself regardless of these norms. So here's some also wonderful pictures of gender norms in other contexts. Okay, people challenging gender norms. Okay. Good eating. We'll talk to you next week. As always, email me if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.